Tori Murden McClure, for starters, is wearing her high school uniform, which, thank you, definitely makes her the best dressed woman in the crowd. Tori Murden McClure serves as a vice president at Spalding University. When she's not working in higher education, she can be found volunteering, rowing, or writing. Tori is best known as the first woman and first American to row solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She was also the first woman and first American to travel over land to the geographic South Pole, skiing 750 miles from the ice shelf to the pole. In April, her memoir, A Pearl in the Storm, How I Found My Heart in the Middle of the Ocean, will be released. A graduate of Collegiate High School here in Louisville, she also holds degrees from Smith College, Harvard University, U of L, and an MFA in writing from Spalding University. Go Pelicans and Eagles. Ladies and gentlemen, Tori Murden McClure.
Go Amazons, yeah. When I wrote A Pearl in the Storm, which was temporarily named by the marketing department at HarperCollins, I had to row across the ocean. I'm so glad it's not called that anymore. When I wrote A Pearl in the Storm, I was not thinking of this evening, so the highlights of my high school career were not as colorful as the one just read, but I will read you what I find. At the age of 15, I left my parents and my brother Lamar behind and moved into my grandmother's house so I could attend the Louisville Collegiate School. My uniform arrived in the mail. I tried it on. The green plaid kilt was hemmed to hang a few inches below the knee. I arrived for school wearing my kilt, my navy blue sweater, my blue knee socks, and my high-top basketball shoes. I just didn't know any better. I barely reached the end of the first hallway before I noticed that every girl in the place was staring at me. A lovely blonde girl named Gracia Huntington started to giggle the instant I entered her line of sight. "What are you laughing at?" I asked. "No one wears a kilt that long," she announced with a chuckle. "You clearly don't know how to dress yourself." I looked around. Every other kilt in the building was hemmed well above the knee. Jennifer Broadus said, "Nice shoes." I felt like a 6-foot-tall billboard whose outfit proclaimed, "This girl does not belong here." Before lunch that first day, I stood in the hallway outside the history classroom trying to roll the waist of my kilt so the hem would not hang quite so low. Noting my dilemma, the history teacher came into the hallway, gave me a knowing smile, and handed me a stapler. I curtsied, took the stapler, and all but ran to the restroom, where I stapled the hem of my kilt until it looked like everyone else's. Each student was assigned to a lunch table. 10 girls sat at each table with a teacher. I found my table, and when I realized that I would have to sit next to Gracia Huntington, I wanted to melt into the floor. When she saw my kilt, Gracia smiled and called me resourceful. I didn't know what that word meant, but it didn't sound like an insult. Then there's rowing, 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 more rowing. Oh, yes, here we go. At the Louisville Collegiate School, Helen Kent Longley was an institution. She made up the entire high school history department. She taught ancient history to the 10th grade, European history to the 11th grade, and American history to the senior class. History had been one of my favorite subjects. A few weeks into the semester, when I took my first history test, I thought I'd done quite well. But when the tests came back, I'd received a D-. Worse, there was a note on top of the sheet. It said, "Please see me." I was devastated. I'd never gotten a D in my life. After class, I bolted from the room. It took me several days to work up enough courage to go and see Mrs. Longley. I entered the classroom. I was so terrified my teeth chattered. I sat in my usual desk. Mrs. Longley took a seat in the desk next to mine. She asked, "What happened?" I'd never taken a test like that before in my life. At my old school, all the tests were true, false, or multiple choice. I thought I did okay. Mrs. Longley went over the test with me question by question. In a format of a conversation, my answers were flawless. Once she satisfied herself that I knew the material, Mrs. Longley stood up and began to pace the room. Mrs. Longley had been in the Navy in World War II, and her military bearing was impossible to miss. "You have never written answers in an essay form?" Barely raising my voice to a whisper, I answered, "No, ma'am." She asked, "Have you ever written a term paper?" My classmates had been discussing term paper since the first day of school. Brimming with frustration, I asked, "What is a term paper?" Before she could stop herself, the words, "Oh my," escaped Mrs. Longley's lips. She took several deep breaths. Once she'd steadied her nerves, she sat next to me again and asked about my academic background. Except for kindergarten and first grade, I'd always gone to public schools. I'd never written anything longer than 2.5 pages. "Okay," Mrs. Longley said, raising a hand as if to indicate she'd heard enough. Then she sat quietly for a long time. "My secret is out. I don't belong in this school. Mrs. Longley knows. They'll send me back to Pennsylvania." There's this pedestal story early in the book. Just as I had when my father found me on top of the pedestal, I burst into tears. I tried to speak. I don't belong." Mrs. Longley, without looking at me, put her hand on my arm, indicating I should remain silent. Something told me that she was calculating whether I had any scholastic merit at all. I could almost visualize her turning over my future in her mind. Mrs. Longley was in her 60s. Was I worth her time? She gazed at the ceiling for a moment, then looked at me. When her decision was made, Mrs. Longley stood with perfect dignity. She walked to her desk, lifted a box of Kleenex, returned, and handed me the box. When I looked up from my desk, Mrs. Longley's eyes were steel blue, and they conveyed assurance. "This is not your fault," she said firmly. "You have intelligence. I believe you are capable of doing this level of work. Your responses this morning prove that you knew the material when you took the test. Your difficulties are mechanical." I attempted to respond, but only managed an unintelligible sob. "You are behind. Your peers have been writing essays and papers since they were old enough to write." I sniffled. "It is understood that collegiate students will have several hours of homework every evening." I nodded. "What might take one of your classmates 3 hours to accomplish may take you 6, but you must do it all." "You must do it all." She stressed that final word, all. I sat a little straighter, managed a proper, "Yes, ma'am." "If you study hard and do all of your homework, I will teach you the mechanics of how to take tests and how to write papers." Then she paused to be sure that she had my full attention. "But I cannot and will not do the work for you." "No, ma'am." "If there are any assignments you do not understand, you will find me here before or after school." "Yes, ma'am." "Now, if you would like to sit for a minute to pull yourself together, that would be acceptable." I would sooner have lingered in a burning building. As I gathered my things to leave, Mrs. Longley opened a heavy book on her desk. Without looking up, she said, "For an educated person, the world is an open book. For the ignorant, it is an unsolved mystery." I wiped the last tears away with my sleeve. "Yes, ma'am." Then Mrs. Longley looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, "You don't like mysteries, do you?" "No, ma'am." Now, I should, given the time, end there, but someone asked me about my shoes. Very quickly. Louisville Collegiate School gave me a fresh start. There was rowing stuff in between here. I would be described as an enigmatic teenager. Where other young women indulged in scholastic and schoolgirl fantasies about musicians and movie actors, I had the names of Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams written on the top of my shoes. One day before gym class, Kim O'Callahan pointed out the names on my high tops and asked, "What, did you cheat at a history test at your old school?" It was a question that other classmates must have been curious about because every one of them paused to hear my response. This situation triggered well-worn defense mechanisms. I didn't say a word. I stepped back to where my back would be protected by a wall. I raised my fists and delivered a glare that sent the message, "The first person who touches me is going to die." Kim took 3 steps back. The other girls exchanged looks of shock and puzzlement. No one moved. After a tense silence, Kim said, "I'm not going to fight you. You're a tree." I relaxed my guard and laughed at Kim's description of me. The room itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Until that moment, I didn't understand that I'd entered an idyllic world where physical violence was anathema. In my earlier life, I'd encountered my share of sticks and stones. I'd heard many names that hurt me. Collegiate was different. Never a stick, never a stone. And after that tense moment in the locker room, my nickname would become Tree.